Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast, or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be diving into a book launched just this week entitled The Hype Machine: How Social Media Disrupts Our Elections, Our Economy, and Our Health, and How We Must Adapt. And my guest today is the author of that book, Professor Sinan Aral. He is the David Austin Professor of Management at MIT and the director of MIT's Initiative on the Digital Economy. And in this interview, we'll dive into some of the key theoretical concepts of the book, which I appreciated in that it tries to get at some of the fundamental workings of social media platforms and how they interact with our brains and the implications that has not just for our relationships socially with friends, but also our relation to politics. We'll also dive into some of Professor Aral's research around fake news diffusion on Twitter, published in Science. And towards the end of the interview, we'll talk a little bit about methods and differences between observational approaches and experimental approaches. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Sinan Aral. Again, he is the David Austin Professor of Management at MIT and director of MIT's Initiative on the Digital Economy. Professor Aral, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So to start out here, can you tell us a little bit about your motivations for writing The Hype Machine? I think the book outlines some of the fundamental mechanisms for how social media platforms operate and then how they influence human perceptions and behavior. And these mechanisms have been in motion for some time. So I'm curious, why did you decide to write the book now?
Well, you cannot turn on your television these days without seeing the consequences of the hype machine or the social media industrial complex in nearly every facet of society. We've got a big election coming up in the United States. We've seen elections around the world, whether it be in Brazil or Sweden or the Brexit vote or India. We have seen, for instance, the spread of genocidal propaganda in Myanmar, most recently this week in Ethiopia. And there are just so many questions about how social media is affecting our privacy, the spread of fake news, and so on. It turns out that I have been researching this topic for 20 years, and I thought that this was an important moment to speak with the world about everything we've learned in this research community over those 20 years.
Definitely. And you've been doing this research at such a high level. I'm looking forward to take a deep dive into some of the key concepts and arguments of the book. But why don't we start out with the title? As you just did, you defined the hype machine as the social media industrial complex. And so I wanted to ask, who are the key actors in this complex and what exactly does hype refer to in the hype machine?
Yeah, so the social media industrial complex is obviously all of the social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, WeChat, LinkedIn, WhatsApp, YouTube, etc., Pinterest, all of which I've worked with directly for many, many years on research trying to understand how behaviors and influence spread over the human social network. But it's also the larger ecosystem of smaller companies that support those platforms, the billions of users that are on the platforms every day, individual citizens like you and me, as well as all of the policymakers that are struggling to figure out how to regulate and or set guardrails on this social media economy. Hype refers to the hyping up of our society. And I call it the hype machine because, as I describe in the book, it runs on an attention economy. And that attention economy runs on engagement. And in order to maximize the profit of the business models that these platforms have initiated, they have to maintain our attention and engagement. And in order to do that, they hype us up in various ways, which I describe in detail in the book.
Yeah, and it leads very well into my next question. And I'd like to dive directly into the book's main theoretical contribution, the hype machine framework, and then kind of illustrate it a bit with some examples from your research. And a key component of that framework is the hype loop, which you describe as a cyclical pattern of action and reaction between human input and machine intelligence. So can you outline what the hype loop is for us and why it's a fundamental dynamic to understand how social media shapes the ways that we engage with society and politics?
Yeah, I really wanted to go under the hood of this ecosystem and describe for people in detail, but in plain common language, exactly how it works. And the hype loop is one of the keys to really understanding that. So, as you said, the hype loop is the dynamic interplay of machine intelligence and human agency. On one hand, the machine or the platform's algorithms take in everything that we read, like, who we connect with, what we do, what we spend our time on, and using models to try and understand what would engage us the most. It uses all this data to suggest or nudge us towards new people to connect to, new things to read, new products to buy, and so on. So that's one side of the loop, what I call the sense and suggest loop, which is the machine senses our interests and suggests new things to us that might interest us. And then the other side of the loop is all about our involvement, human agency, the choices we make. And that's what I call the consume act side of the loop, which is we consume these suggestions and act on them. So we take some of the suggestions of what to read and we discard others of them. We take some of the suggestions of who to connect to next and discard others of them. And the choices we make feed back into the machine intelligence because it tells the machine essentially what we're liking of their suggestions and what we're not. And this continuous dynamic feedback loop really does determine in large part the outcomes that we see in society. And I kind of unfold the narrative story of how this is impacting everything from political polarization to the spread of fake news in society.
So we have this dynamic hype loop process, which, as you argue, is enabled by digital social networks and materialized through smartphone hardware. But taking a step back, you also talk about the structural factors or levers that you identify as influencing the hype loop. And these are things like money, code, laws, and norms. And at the macro level, all social media platforms are influenced by these factors, but they also differ according to each platform and the national context where platforms operate. So within the hype machine framework, how do you see platform differences factoring in?
Yeah, so we have seen a decade of techno-utopianism about the hype machine, followed by a decade of techno-dystopianism about the hype machine. In the first decade, social media was going to connect the world and give us economic opportunity and provide us with all the information for free and create a platform for free speech and distribute life-saving health information and so on. And then in the decade of techno-dystopianism, which we've witnessed in the last 10 years, as Sacha Baron Cohen called it at his keynote at the Anti-Defamation League, the hype machine is the greatest propaganda machine in history. Right now, we see the documentary The Social Dilemma, which is another in a line of films like The Great Hack that came before it, and kind of a clarion call, which I think is necessary, highlighting the potential dangers of the hype machine for society. What I wanted for this book to do is to transcend the techno-utopianism on one hand and the techno-dystopianism on the other and really ask, what can we do? How can we roll up our sleeves and do things that can help us achieve the promise of social media and avoid the peril? And the way that I lay that out in the book are these four levers: money, code, norms, and laws. Money refers to the business models of the hype machine, the incentives that are created by the business models that we've erected. Code refers to the design of the platforms and the algorithms, as we discussed the hype loop, and how we can design them to achieve the promise and avoid the peril. Norms refers to how we adopt and use social media, which is such an important factor in what we get out of it. And laws, obviously, are about regulation, how we regulate and set guardrails around the market failures that are created by the hype machine. And money, code, norms, and laws are how we are going to achieve the promise and avoid the peril of the hype machine. And as you said, the use of these four levers, which I detail in excruciating detail, especially in the last chapter, which is the longest chapter in the book about how we must adapt and how we can achieve the promise and avoid the peril, they differ in different national contexts. So, for instance, a great example is the spread of falsity or fake news online. So, when you're regulating speech in a liberal democracy, of course, we want to promote free speech, but sometimes free speech contravenes the rights of others. And the First Amendment, for instance, in the United States, will impinge on equal protection, the 14th Amendment of other people. We have laws against hate speech. We have anti-defamation laws. We have libel laws and so on. But in an authoritarian government, the regulation of speech under the guise of stopping the spread of information can be used to suppress minority opinions. We've seen this in Russia. We've seen this in the Philippines. We've seen this in parts of Africa. And so how we pull these four levers, money, code, norms, and laws, needs to be carefully thought out with a scientific perspective and needs to be informed by expertise and contextual evidence in the region in which it's being adopted.
Yeah. And I'm really interested in one of these levers, which is code. And I think, that's mostly within the realm of the software developers themselves. And I'm curious, when you talk about the hype machine, it's sort of, lumping in all these platforms together because they're driven by these shared goals of, to increase engagement or to reduce engineering complexity. But on the one hand, we have platforms converging their code towards, for example, creating live stories because that seems to work, but they also have to differentiate to maintain a competitive market advantage. And so do you think that these platform idiosyncrasies encourage differential effects for how we engage with politics, or are they overshadowed by the broader sort of logics or motivations towards driving engagement?
Well, I think both. I think there is an overall logic to the attention economy and to the engagement that is sought because these platforms seek to maximize profit by maximizing engagement. And I think that that is an underlying driving force. I talk about it at length in the chapter that describes the hype loop, but also in the chapter called The Attention Economy and the Tyranny of Trends, which really does get into this driving force of engagement. But I also think that idiosyncrasies of how the platforms are designed have significant effects on differentiating the engagement models and also the effects that each of these platforms has on society. And I spell that out in a number of ways throughout the book. A great example is just to take the notion of WhatsApp as an encrypted private messaging application and Facebook itself separately. So on WhatsApp, you don't have algorithms that are spreading messages based on people's preferences. You have people sharing messages with each other without algorithmic amplification of messages, but really in a group-based and individual-based spreading of messages. On Facebook, obviously, you have the news feed and you have the friend suggestion algorithm, which drives the structure of the social network and then the flow of information over it through algorithms. And so these design choices affect how information flows over the network, how the network evolves. And as information flows over the network, it affects our beliefs, perceptions, and therefore our behaviors. And that affects us at the voting booth, in the shopping mall, and even on dating apps. So another great example, you may be surprised to hear that relationships that were suggested by algorithms surpassed relationships created by the suggestions of friends and family in 2013. So 7 years ago, which means that the vast majority of the relationships and therefore potentially the children that are being born out of those relationships are being created through algorithms rather than traditional human interaction that we've known for centuries. What is the impact of that on our genetic diversity, our human evolution? These are open questions that we don't have the answers to. But if you think about dating apps, some of them allow you to browse other people and to choose yourself who you want to date. Others simply give you choices to either accept or decline suggestions by an algorithm. This design choice fundamentally alters who you meet and who you date. So I think that the ramifications are far reaching, and the code, the design, matters a great deal.
Yeah, I think you mentioned all the different sort of documentaries coming out. I think if there was one on this, it might be Cyborgs or something to describe these algorithmically generated children to an extent.
Right.
It would be interesting. But so that's looking at the differences across platforms. But zooming out and sort of getting back to the hype machine framework, you argue that the interaction between the sort of structural levers we've been discussing and the hype loop encourages three broader societal trends: hypersocialization, personalized mass persuasion, and the attention economy. So can you describe for us how these three trends, separately and together, work to shape our perceptions of politics?
Absolutely. So personalized mass persuasion is about the ability to micro-target persuasive messages to individuals and groups at population scale. And that's never been seen before in the context of a social network. So we've had television, which was the ability to send persuasive messages to very broad audiences for a long time. We had newspapers before that. We've had the internet, which allows us to personalize messages based on browsing behavior or demographics or what you've looked at in the past. But we've never had a technology that institutionalizes these hyper micro targeted messages at population scale in the context of social groups and social networks, where you can then share those messages with your friends, or you can target those messages based on what your friends saw, or you can put your friends' faces in a message to encourage social proof, which increases the effectiveness of those messages. All of those techniques and how they work, and the very large randomized experiments that have been conducted to figure out how they work and when they don't, are all detailed in the book. And in the context of many different things. So there are experiments that are described in the book about voting. There are experiments that are described in the book about exercise. There are experiments described in the book about product adoption. And all of those things are examples of how personalized mass persuasion, which didn't exist before the hype machine, works. Hypersocialization is about how the hype machine injects the opinions, beliefs, and perceptions of our friends into our daily decisions every day. So there's a long chapter in the book called Your Brain on Social Media, which is about the neuroscience of what happens in our brains as we use social media. And in that chapter, I described how the human brain evolved over many, many years to process social signals. It's a large part of the reason why human brains are bigger relative to our body size than most other species on the planet, and why our neocortex ratio, the ratio of our neocortex to the rest of our brain, is so large as well. And then we invented the hype machine, which essentially scales these social signals that our brain evolved to process into the trillions. So social media's meteoric rise is no surprise, because it's like tossing a lit match into a pool of gasoline. We evolved our brains to process these social signals. Then we invented a technology that delivers trillions of these social signals to our brains every day in likes, comments, shares, what our friends ate for dinner last night, what of our photographs they liked, and so on. And hypersocialization describes the consequence of creating a technology that injects our friends' opinions and beliefs and perceptions into our decisions every day. And what is the effect of that on exercise and voting and dating and news consumption and product adoption? The last trend, what I call the attention economy, or the tyranny of trends, and it's all about how the social media ecosystem works in terms of generating attention as its business model, and then selling that attention as a precursor to persuasion, and the notion of algorithmic amplification, which is all about taking things that are trending or that are becoming popular and massively amplifying their popularity by spreading them even more through algorithms, creating a very skewed distribution of attention where the most popular items get the vast majority or lion's share of attention, and then there's a long tail of attention that exists for everything else. And the consequences of that, which, as I describe in the following chapter, is a big part of how the hype machine destroys the wisdom of crowds.
I'd like to take a look at some of these trends in light of your recent research findings published in Science about true versus false news diffusion on Twitter. And there, by analyzing 10 years of Twitter data, you found that false news, and in particular false news about politics, spread farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than news that was true. And your proposed explanation for that finding is what you refer to as the novelty hypothesis. So can you outline what the novelty hypothesis is and how the trends we just discussed might relate to it?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was some of the scariest results I've seen in my scientific research. We did look at all of the true and false verified news stories that ever spread on Twitter from its inception in 2006 to 2017, 10 years of data. And as you said, we found that false news traveled farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information. And we were curious as to why this was. So at first we thought, well, maybe false news spreaders are just different than true news spreaders. Maybe they have more followers, or they follow more people, or maybe they're more often verified users of Twitter, or maybe they've been on Twitter longer or tweet more often. And we checked each one of these explanations in turn and found the opposite was true. False news spreaders had fewer followers, followed fewer people, tweeted less often, were less often verified, and so on. And so none of these things could explain why false news was traveling so much faster than the truth online. So we had to seek an alternative explanation, and we came to what we called the novelty hypothesis, as you state. And the reason we thought about this was if you read the cognitive science literature, you find that human attention is drawn to novelty. And if you read the sociology literature, you find that we gain in status when we share novel information because we're seen as being, quote unquote, in the know or having access to inside information. So it increases our status. So we looked at the novelty of true and false news compared to what people in our data had seen in the 2 months prior to seeing a true or false news tweet come over their Twitter network. And what we found was that, yes, false news was way more novel in an information theoretic sense than the truth, and that false news was 70% more likely to be retweeted than the truth. But we went a step further and we looked at the replies to false and true news in the replies to these tweets. And what we found when we analyzed the sentiment in the replies was that replies to false news tweets typically expressed surprise, anger, and disgust. And replies to true news tweets expressed anticipation, joy, and trust. So false news was more novel, and people were expressing that they were more surprised, angered, and disgusted by false news. And so surprising, salacious, blood-boiling, anger-inducing information is more likely to be shared on social media.
Yeah, and I really like how that study has such a longitudinal approach, and it gets to one of these core aspects of social media. So I just wanted to sort of highlight that for the listeners. But going back to the hype machine, what I enjoyed about the book was that it tries to get to these sort of fundamental aspects of how social media works across various sectors. So whether we're talking about commercial products, election interference, or discussions around public health, you argue that there are core mechanisms of the hype machine that influence these sort of varied phenomena in similar ways. And for me, one of the most interesting parts of the book was the notion of causal lift. And you discuss how the Russian IRA could be compared to a commercial brand seeking to increase their ROI through integrated digital marketing. So I want to get into that. What is causal lift, and why is it important to understand election interference?
Yeah, the two questions that I'm asked most often as a business educator in my role as an entrepreneur and an investor on one hand, and as a scientist on the other are, one, did Russia tip the 2016 US presidential election? And two, how do I measure the ROI on my marketing budget? And the interesting thing about these two questions is that their answers are the same. The same process to determine whether Russia influenced the election in 2016, whether it will do so in 2020, is the same process to understand what a marketer's efforts on the hype machine do to change product adoption and therefore revenues and the success of marketing. And lift can be understood in a very simple example. So when I teach marketing at MIT, I give this simple example to my students about lift. So imagine that you're a student in my class, and we're not in a pandemic, so we're in the physical classroom. And on the first day of class, you're coming into my classroom, and I'm greeting all of the students at the door, and I've got a stack of leaflets advertising the class in my hand. So as each student comes in to take their seat in the classroom, I say, "Hi, I'm your professor. Here's a leaflet for the class. Welcome." And they all take a leaflet and sit down. So they've all sat down in their chairs waiting for the first session of the class, and they've all got their leaflets on their desks in front of them. And the first question I ask the students is, what's the conversion rate on those ads that I gave you at the door? In other words, what fraction of the people who saw those ads converted into taking the class? And all the hands go up, and the very clear, obvious answer is 100%. The conversion rate is 100%. So 100% of the people who saw the leaflet took the class. And then I ask, how much did that leaflet change your behavior? And the obvious answer to that question is not at all, because they had already decided to take the class. And that's the difference between lift and conversion rates. Conversion rates are the fraction of people who saw the ad who took the behavior that the ad is advertising. And lift is the degree to which the persuasive message changed people's behavior. And this isn't just about ads for products. It's true about get out the vote campaigns. We use it, for instance, in a very large nationwide study combating HIV/AIDS in South Africa in my research group. It's true about getting people to socially distance. It's true about quit smoking campaigns. It's true about any persuasive message you can think of. And I describe in the book in detail how to rigorously measure lift and why understanding lift is the key to understanding how the hype machine impacts our world. It's the key to understanding if and how Russia is influencing voting. It's also the key for marketers to understand how their persuasive messages are changing consumers' behavior. It's the key to public health organizations understanding how their messaging is getting people to socially distance, to wear masks, to use condoms, to quit smoking, et cetera. And so it really is the key to understanding the hype machine's impact on our world.
Right. Yeah, I thought that was super interesting. And you go into all the sort of, statistics behind it and make that argument in full in the book. But I want to switch gears to another topic, which is political polarization. And I think in the book, you're very careful about not drawing a causal link between social media and increased polarization. But you do position prior experimental research in a way that seems to suggest a link between the two. And we've just discussed this on the show recently, that social media may encourage homophilous networks and exposure to attitude confirming information. But the leap between online network homophily and political polarization is sort of, the jury's still out on that one. So can you recount your argument pertaining to the hype machine and polarization?
Yeah, this is such an important point. As I say in the book, there is a lot of hype surrounding the hype machine. So I was able to watch the Social Dilemma documentary last night, and I was, on one hand, really happy to see the clarion call about all of the potential dangers of the hype machine. But I was also a little dismayed to see a lack of rigor, a lack of scientific rigor about how it really works under the hood. And that's really the point of this book, is to give us, society, and everyone who's listening and reading this book, a sense of what we actually know through scientific evidence about the effects of the hype machine, what we know to be true, what we know to be not true, and what we don't yet know. And so the Social Dilemma obviously, touts or implies, I should say, that the hype machine is responsible for political polarization. It's responsible for all the violence that you're seeing in the streets because everyone is in their filter bubbles and so on. And in the book, I actually go through all of the scientific evidence for and against the hype machine's responsibility for political polarization. And any student of political communication will know that there are a numerous set of factors that are influencing political polarization. And there is a tremendous amount of scientific inquiry into the causes and consequences of political polarization in the United States and around the world. And it is a disservice to talk about political polarization without being rigorous about all of the mountains of evidence that we have about polarization in the political science literature and in the political communications literature and so on. And that's why I am careful throughout the book about every single claim, because I am a scientist first. Now, in terms of political polarization, the simplest way to describe it, and I encourage your listeners to read the book to get the details, is twofold. One is that there are a number of things that affect both affective and ideological political polarization in the United States and around the world. And I go through all of those explanations in the book rather than just focusing on social media. That's point one. Point two is there have been a number of very large experimental studies that test the concept of filter bubbles and echo chambers created by social media. And I go through all of that evidence in the book as well. And the basic takeaway is that there are a number of things that affect political polarization, but we have seen in multiple large-scale experimental studies that I've conducted and that others have conducted, that algorithms that recommend content and friends based on what you've liked in the past narrow our choices and our content consumption, make what we consume more narrow, more similar to what our friends are consuming, and different to what everyone else is consuming, which really does support this echo chamber or filter bubble effect. And these are experimental studies, so they're causal. But making that broader leap and saying that social media is the true cause of political polarization misses a lot of scientific rigor. And I think that we need to be rigorous if we're to have any hope of having a meaningful impact on the hype machine's role in our world.
Definitely. And kind of picking up on this idea of experiments and large-scale experiments, my last two questions for you have to deal kind of with methods and your thoughts on methods and data, because you've worked, so long with social media and social media research. So I'm first curious to get your thoughts on the value of observational trace data versus experiments when it comes to social media research. I mean, you've used both in your research. So how do you see the pros and cons of each?
Yes, both are relevant and important to advancing knowledge, but they have different roles. So a lot of my research focuses on causal inference, trying to understand cause and effect, trying to understand how social media and social media messages diffusing over the hype machine influence our beliefs, perceptions, and behaviors. And to get at influence, to get at persuasion, to get at behavior change, you really have to have a notion of causal inference or causality at its core. It's analogous to the lift that we described earlier for understanding the hype machine's impact on our world. And in order to do that, experiments are invaluable because randomization, having a control group, a randomly held out control group, is by far the best way to get at causal inference, to understand the causal effects of social media on our world. But observational data are easier to come by, and they also have an important role in our understanding of how the hype machine works. There are also many ways to take observational data and still achieve causal estimates of the impact of the hype machine, to be able to make causal interpretations with observational data. And one of the best ways to do that is what I call natural experiments. So random variation, or good as random variation, that exists in society that's not created by a designed randomized experiment, but that just happens naturally. And there are a number of different examples described in the book of natural experiments that we've used to get at causal inference. So in short, I think that both observational and experimental data are both very useful in our understanding of the hype machine. Experimental data is absolutely essential because we need good causal inference to understand the true causal effect of the hype machine in our world. But observational data is also important, and you can use observational data and still make causal inferences through things like natural experiments and other sophisticated statistical techniques.
Yeah, I definitely think they can feed into one another in that way. And lastly, what are your thoughts on data or knowledge sharing between platforms and researchers? You've worked in close collaboration with platforms in your research, and over the course of the book, you highlight several studies that have had similar partnerships with platforms. And so, in your experience, what type of value do these partnerships provide, and what's your ideal model for data access for researchers moving forward?
Well, this is such an important question. It's so essential. So, all of our understanding of how the hype machine works and how it impacts our economies, our democracies, our elections, our public health, the spread of misinformation, et cetera, depends on access to data from the platforms because they hold all the keys to our understanding of the inner workings of the hype machine. So we have to have more transparent sharing of data with researchers to understand the hype machine's impact on society. We've seen some good examples of collaborations between the platforms and scientists to reveal how the hype machine works. Our collaboration with Twitter on the 10-year study of fake news was a great example of that. They provided us with unprecedented access to the entire historical archive of Twitter. The results were not necessarily designed to look good for them, but Jack Dorsey personally, supported our project, and that was such a forward-looking and supportive of society's values perspective. Other cases, you've seen the platforms contract their access to scientists, and in other words, make it harder to get access to data. We've seen Social Science One, which was created by Nate Persily at Stanford and Gary King at Harvard. They tried to create an industry academic partnership to get access to this kind of data. They faced innumerable delays, roadblocks in getting access to the data that the platforms and Facebook in particular promised that they would give. Then Facebook did come through and give a very large swath of data eventually after many, many delays and a lot of public and private pressure. But we need more efforts like this, these industry academic partnerships that allow us to analyze data in an objective way and to report our findings to society, to understand how the hype machine is helping us, hurting us, influencing our behavior, influencing our elections, influencing our public health. And we need to work out ways to make those types of partnerships work. And I suggest a number of different avenues in the book, including data safe harbors, industry academic partnerships like Social Science One, and other avenues.
Yeah, I just want to follow up with one last question on that, because kind of what I'm getting at is we've seen Social Science One recently is sort of having another tier for researchers to get privileged access around the 2020 elections by researchers handpicked by the Social Science One board. And so I'm curious, like, in your view, because you've actually worked directly with platforms and a lot of researchers haven't, what are your thoughts on that kind of tiered access to the type of data that's published in Nature and Science?
Well, I mean, I think that it's a double-edged sword, obviously. So number one is that you want to pre-qualify the quote-unquote scientists, right? Because it could just create a backdoor for nefarious actors who either aren't actually scientists or want to use the data for nefarious purposes or are not qualified to answer the questions that they are asking, do not have appropriate protocols in their labs for the security and protection of the data, et cetera. And so that pre-qualification step is important. But on the other hand, it kind of creates a hierarchy of access to data among scientists as well. And so I guess the answer to your question is that it's in essence a necessary evil, but it should be egalitarian in the sense that the people who are making the decisions on who should have access to this data should try their best to create equal access among scientists to the data, and not to really kind of make decisions based on maybe the pet questions of the board but really broadly make the data accessible to real scientists with real expertise and real ability to provide security measures for the data. But that we do need some sort of pre-qualification so that we don't get, for example, other new examples like Cambridge Analytica, where the data is passed to a political campaigning organization to the detriment of users' privacy or other societal values.
Yeah, it's a tough question, as are the topics tackled in the book. So, Professor Aral, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Really appreciate your time. Thank you for having me. And again, I appreciate it. Thanks.
I've just been speaking with Sinan Aral, David Austin Professor of Management at MIT and Director of MIT's Initiative on the Digital Economy. The book we've been discussing is called The Hype Machine: How Social Media Disrupts Our Elections, Our Economy, and Our Health, and How We Must Adapt. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I've got some more episodes heading your way before the US election, so subscribe if you haven't already. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Melbourne. See you next time.